privacy. So, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here this evening, especially when this is a very nice evening. I'm sure you have other things that you would rather be doing. But for those of you who don't know me, I'm Libby Hill and I'm a consultant speech and language therapist. And this year actually marks 40 years since I qualified. And it's changed such a lot in that time. I mean, I really wish that therapists who are more newly qualified could have seen how the world was at that time, because it was so much better for speech and language therapists. So we had newly qualified ones starting every year. Every department had new ones every year. But in every department, you had specialists in the different areas. So there might be a specialist in voice, there might be a specialist in stammering. We even had one in cleft palate. We had one specializing in autism, language disorders, speech disorders. And it was great for us newly qualifieds because we could say, well, don't take these clients on, coach me, show me how to do it. But we knew nothing about selective mutism, absolutely nothing. It was only 2 years previously that they moved it from elective mutism to selective mutism. And, I remember having clients and going to my supervisor and saying, I don't know what to do with the first one was a little girl who wasn't talking at school, but her dad could get her to talk by giving her a pound. Well, a pound in 1986 was worth a lot more than it is now. And so she was talking for the pound. So I just couldn't suss it out. And I decided there and then that I actually wanted to know more about this because I hate if anything beats me. I need to know more about it. I want to be able to understand it. So during those 40 years, I have worked with thousands of children and young people. But over the last decade, there's two groups of clients who have really captured my attention. So we've got PDA and teenagers with selective mutism. Because, when most people think about selective mutism, they're picturing a young child, maybe starting school, hiding behind their parents' legs, and maybe they can't answer the register. That's the image that we have actually become familiar with, isn't it? But that's not who this book is about. This is about the 14-year-old who hasn't spoken in school for 5 years. It's about the 16-year-old who desperately wants friends but can't join a conversation. It's about the young person who can laugh with siblings at home but feels physically unable to say good morning at school. It's about teenagers who are often misunderstood because they don't fit the traditional picture of selective mutism. So teenagers with selective mutism hasn't changed, but hopefully our understanding of them is beginning to change. And certainly that's one of the points of the book. I want people to fully understand the situation. Now, one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that the teenagers are not just anxious. They might have all sorts of other issues going on that are affecting their ability to process language. Many of them have spent years being passed between professionals. So you find that one service says, oh, it's anxiety. Another service says, oh, it's autism. All people with selective mutism are autistic. Someone else says they're choosing not to talk. They're being described as oppositional, avoidant, or simply shy. I'm not sure which is worse, really. But what I'm finding is that people haven't stepped back and asked the obvious question. What's actually happening for this young person? So I felt this book needed to exist because most of the guidance actually stopped at early childhood or at primary school. So like I say, they were either being overlooked or described as things that they weren't. But the secondary school had increased the demands. So basically, maybe they hadn't been able to speak easily in primary school, but the demands of secondary school had ramped up massively, which had then caused this issue. So they weren't able now to speak in secondary school. If I look at the children with selective mutism who were referred for EHCP assessments in 2025 to Small Talk, this is the majority. So the typical person has gone into year 7 and they have fallen off a cliff. And then we usually get them when they've had a period of burnout and they're not able to attend school at all. But it needed to exist because families and schools kept asking, well, what should we do? So there are many schools out there that were desperate to know how they could help. What should they be doing? What might they be doing to make it worse? But there was no practical guidance that was actually centered on adolescence. And the teenage years are different because we see speech or the lack of the speech as a visible difficulty. But this impact reaches learning, friendships, identity, safety, and the future. It's not just about the talking. And I realized that many teenagers had become experts at masking. So the parents would be describing a completely different child from the one that the professionals saw. So teachers would describe them as quiet, compliant. Parents described meltdowns, shutdowns, exhaustion, not wanting to go to school or being unable to go to school. So I needed some explanations. I needed something that was going to make a difference. So it becomes harder when they move into secondary school because it's more complex. So their whole life becomes more complex. So they've gone from one teacher, many teachers, lots of classrooms, peers who don't know you, transitions, and so many unwritten expectations. There's much more scrutiny. So there's greater awareness about, I mean, this is a typical teenager, never mind somebody with selective mutism, but greater awareness of their voice, of their difference, of their mistakes, other people's reactions. Then you add more independence. So you're now expected to seek help for yourself, to advocate for yourself, to consent about things. You've got to look into healthcare. Then there's the exams, there's the travel, there's the future planning. That's massive. And all of those things are important. So I showed this book to somebody called Paul, who I'd worked with. So he's left school now. And he said, I just wish a book like this had been around when I was at school. He feels that it would have made his life much easier. So basically, 505 young people. I thought it was 400 and something. And then when I actually sat down and looked at it, it was 505. So they trusted me with their stories. So these aren't statistics, they're stories. And they wanted someone to understand. So it began with a simple question in 2010. So I just met a group of 4 young people who had had selective mutism in school, but had gone on to be able to speak once they'd left school. And they were fascinating. And we had a really good conversation, but their insight left me wanting to listen more widely. And so I didn't work with the 505. They came to me. So the responses grew through clinical work, support groups, peer networks. And I deliberately left it as an open question so people could answer in their own words. And this was the question. What is useful for staff in secondary schools to know about helping teenagers with selective mutism? Now, you can tell I'm no academic because that made my job a lot harder. Because I had a lot of narrative. I had an awful lot of information. And I've used this in training over the years about the percentages and what they actually said and how they felt and what we should do. But I just needed, as a thank you really for their time and their insight, I needed to do something more with that. But like I say, I'm not an academic, I'm a curious clinician. If I was an academic, I would have made the job a little bit easier. Now, what I did learn from the 505 was that actually we can't make sweeping generalizations. So something like where to sit in the classroom. Now, I had to that point had always thought, oh, well, if they sit at the front by the teacher, then the teacher can work out, if they haven't understood something, or if they feel they might need a break or need to leave the class or need help or whatever, the teacher will be there and will be able to spot them. But that wasn't the case at all. There was a percentage who said, yeah, I want to be at the front. There was some who said, I want to sit at the back because I don't want anybody looking at the back of my head. There were lots that said, don't care where the door is, but I'm sitting by it. So it was really interesting to know that we need to get the views of the individual, because that is one of the faults of us professionals. We tend to think we know best. If we think they need to be sitting at the front, then that's where they should be. We need to listen. And if they can't talk to us, we need to find a way that we can listen. And there were lots of things that repeatedly made things harder. So there were recurrent themes in there. So the first one was unexpected attention. So they didn't want to be called upon. They didn't want to be watched. They didn't want to be waited for or asked again. So if they hadn't been able to answer, just move on. That was a common thing. And then a lot of them told me about well-meant pressure. So it doesn't matter how well meant it is. So whether it's encouragement or humor, rewards or consequences, it's still pressure. And the more pressure you put on people, the less likely they're going to be able to speak. And the third one was the inaccessible help. So knowing the answer, but not being able to get that across, and then worrying that people think you don't know the answer, or needing support but being unable to initiate. So, most of them told me that the teacher, not all teachers, but the ones who really wanted to help had perhaps given them some cards to put on the desk. So, put me a red card on the desk if you need some help. But I think it was 90% had said, I can't use that. How could I have used that? It's like it's having like a great big sign saying, I'm thick, I didn't get it. And they all were really consistent in that one, that they couldn't use that. So ideally, you need a proactive person who knows you really well to notice things. But now we've got technology. Why can't we use messaging or texting or WhatsApping? I know now they're not allowed to use their phone, but I do have guidance around that if you need that. But that inaccessible help. And then they found that the unstructured time, so breaks, lunch, or spontaneous interaction, were actually often the hardest. But there was nowhere to go. There was nothing to do. And, that a lot of them described as feeling like Billy No Mates, or hanging on the periphery of a group, but knowing perhaps you weren't really wanted there because you weren't keeping up with the conversation. It, when I actually sat down to consider them to write the book, I actually felt really sad and really depressed, because the general message was they hadn't been supported and that little things would have made a massive difference. And that's why I thought, I've got to write it. I have a duty to them for giving their time up. So what repeatedly helped, this was quite good. So one trusted adult. So someone consistent who understood them and that they didn't apply pressure. It always shocks me really about how many professionals don't understand about connection or the basics of interaction. So somebody last week was telling, I won't say what the profession was, but they were telling me that they'd sat next to one of my clients and he hadn't said anything. So she'd got up and walked away because he wasn't engaged. And I had to bite my tongue because what I wanted to say was, you mean you didn't have the skills to engage him? And it wouldn't have been verbal interaction that she should have been expecting, but he would have given her communication if she had just let him breathe, get used to her, read her. The chances are he would have interacted with her. Another thing that repeatedly helped was quiet check-ins, so low pressure ways to offer help, but without demanding initiation. You know, nearly everybody, and I see this as well in my clients, if somebody comes, if they're struggling with something, but somebody comes up and says, "Are you okay?" 99.99999% will nod their head or say yes if they can, because it's easier than explaining why. And especially if you can't talk as well in that particular situation. So you just want people to go away and leave you alone and back off. So you either say fine or you're fine. And they found that, communication choices, what we should be doing in 2026 is accepting all forms of communication. So writing, email, gesture, and technology, if they're all treated as valid, the young people said it was a game changer, because some can't text or they can't email, but many can. So again, we've got to find out. We've got to get the answer to lots of these questions. And the other thing that was helpful was trusted peers. So a friend or a consistent partner and very small group opportunities. So some said that they didn't like it if they were put into groups of four, but others didn't mind as long as it wasn't more than four. The only thing we have to think about there is that I've come across various situations where the trusted peer has been given more responsibility than they should. So they're actually doing the adult's job for them. So where they really needed a TA to support them throughout the day, we've relied on their friends. It doesn't happen now because I now say absolutely not. That person can't be, they're their friend. Let them do what friends do, but please don't expect adult responsibility from them. So I've had a couple of situations fairly recently where a school has expected the friend to help them transition out of a class, for instance, or find their way around the school, or support them in many different ways. But what happens is that becomes too much of a task for that trusted friend. And so what's happened in both cases recently is they almost engineered a fallout because they just can't cope. So one of what had happened was a boy had frozen in class. This happens quite a lot. He'd frozen in class in a secondary school. And of course, the next class are then coming in and saying, "What's he doing there? He's not in our class, miss. What's he doing there?" And so the friend had been called from another class to move him on, and then had been late to his class, and he got into trouble and got a detention. Um, you know, a messy, horrible situation. So yes, trusted peers, but don't give them the job of the adult. Um, and one of the things that really hit home was speaking more did not always mean feeling less anxious. So, they'd managed to speak, but nothing was happening about their other issues. And when we looked at some of the other issues that they were reporting, some of them had language difficulties, some knew they had attention issues, sensory processing, executive functioning, interoception, emotional regulation. They might be autistic, have ADHD, fatigue. Maybe the communication environment wasn't right. Maybe they didn't feel safe. So no wonder that speech had disappeared. So the survey changed the clinical question for me. So it wasn't, has speech increased? It was, what's the internal cost of speaking? And not which standard technique comes next or which one shall we do. It's, what does this teenager identify as safe and helpful? And like I say, there was no single approach that worked for everyone. Now, I used to think that if somebody was autistic, that we couldn't use the traditional speech elicitation techniques, the sliding in. So one of my bugbears is that everybody knows about sliding in, so they just go straight for sliding in. And I knew that worked when you were younger, but it does not work for teenagers, particularly if they're autistic. So I felt that we needed to do different things if they were autistic or they were teenagers. What I realize now is that speech work is only one layer, and it should not be the first. So my safe steps is the sequence matters. So what needs to happen first is getting the person to feel safe, get the environment right, train the staff. Then to look at regulation, and this is often where we can't do without an OT. I'm really lucky to work with some fantastic OTs, but we need to look at that. Then we also need to look at their emotional experience. So we need to build their confidence. We need to build their self-esteem. We need them to realize that actually being measured by how you speak is actually wrong anyway. Let's look at who you are. Then step 4, you can actually look at beginning to get some speech going. If that's what they want to do and if that's appropriate, it might not be. We might not get to that step. But those first steps are so important that if I actually look at the percentage of young people that I've worked on speech elicitation with, it's actually quite small compared to the number of children whose cases I've worked with, should I say, who I've supported. So getting the safety and the environment right often allows them to be able to talk anyway. So it wasn't just the ones who were autistic who needed that. Actually, it's everybody who needs that. So we can still do Mikey Johnson's lovely techniques and work, but we would do it at stage 4 with teenagers or anybody who's autistic. And then stage 5 would be communication and participation and joining in with whatever environment they want to be in. For that one, I don't know whether you're aware of Claire Carroll's and Abigail Stern's piece of work, where they've taken the preparation for adulthood document and made that into a much more user-friendly piece of work. And the young person owns it. So they go through it and they work out what they can do, what they can't do, and what they would like to be better at. So again, it's taking the power from the professional and it's giving it to the young person. So they own it, and a few of them will say to me, I'm fine, don't need to do anything on that, Libby. I don't need it. But then later on, they'll have a reason why they might need to do it. So they often text me and say, actually, do you know? And a lot of that is actually to do with relationships. So it tends that it's the boys who tend to be, nope, I'm fine, don't need it, no problem. And then they'll come, they'll text me and say, there's a girl at the bus stop and I don't know what to say to her, but I'd really like to. And that's when you can then use some of the traditional, so there's some of the social thinking, as long as you're saying to them, look, this is just how neurotypicals work. I can show you, you can do it if you want to, but not if you don't want to, then it does actually work really well. But it's called the safe steps. So it's very much at their own pace and knowing that safety and environment actually has to come first. So inside the book, we start off with understanding what selective mutism is, what it's not. So I've put the comedy factors in there. So obviously everybody starts off being able to speak, they're born being able to cry, make noises, etc. So we need to look at the factors making up their profile of selective mutism. So Lorraine Carmody from the University of Ulster has done some work on that. So we talk about that. Then we move on to assessment. So what should we be looking at? And ideally, we need a multidisciplinary team to support the child or young person, but also for the assessment. Then we look at support. And what I've tried to do is to look at the things that people have brought to me. So how do I tell other people I've got selective mutism? You might not want your colleagues or your peers to know anything about it, but what if you do? What if you've decided, how could we do that? So we look at some ways that you could actually do that. How do you tell grandparents or sports coaches, what's useful for them to be able to know? So I've tried to look at not just the school, but everyday life, and then moving onwards into the future. So one of the things that I'm asked such a lot is driving lessons and driving tests. And so I've even got a chapter on that, but we've got a chapter on, applying for PIP, applying for an EHCP. So if you're a parent or whether you're a Senko, it's all in there. So I've tried to cover everything. So it is quite thick, as you can see here. Um, but that's because it's got a lot in it. And ideally, you can actually, pick it up and be able to support a young child from the start. What we are going to do in October, for anybody really who's interested, but I was thinking, specifically speech and language therapists or educational psychologists, Dawn and I are putting on a 2-day accredited course on training you to be able to, everything you will need to be able to do. So it pulls from the book, but you'll have a practical pack as well. So, like I say, understanding, talk about the lived experience. So it's really interesting how the young people, so I summarize the things they tell me in one of the chapters, and in the following chapter, I use what they actually said it felt like. And that's really fascinating. Um, then obviously the assessment looks at the profiling, the intervention, the co-occurring needs. We look at school, so we look at how to reduce the anxiety in the environment. There's actually an example of one school. They don't want to be named, which is a shame because they're so good. So I've taken the factors that we discuss in one chapter and then showed you how it actually worked in real time in this particular school. We've got tips for Senko. So, how do you get the message across to everybody? Because that's always a difficulty. How do you keep it in the front of people's minds? Then there's all sorts of things for everyday life, the hidden barriers. There's a question and answer section on, well, going to the toilet, eating in front of people, loads and loads of things that we don't think about that go alongside that. And then we do transitions at every angle, but we also look at the post-16, we look at university, what support you might need there, employment, what support you might need there. So the idea is it's practical. As I say, I'm not an academic, I'm practical. And it's got tools that you can use straight away. So you've got individual communication profiles and pupil passports. You've got decision-making guidance and the graded speech approaches. There's medical and university supports. There's how to measure it in school. Like I say, EHCP guidance and request templates, and these practical plans for transitions and everyday participation. So who did I write it for? Well, obviously, it's the voice of the young people themselves. That's really who I wrote it for, because I felt I couldn't just file away what they told me. But I need other teenagers to know that they're not broken, they're not difficult, they're not the only ones. One of the things that I find when I meet a young person for the first times, particularly if they're the ones who are so anxious they can't talk to me, when I had my therapy dog, who's had to retire now, I found it a lot easier because if they couldn't talk to me, they actually could talk to him, even if it was, I mean, the number of people who've cried into his neck fur, but sometimes they've talked into his neck fur. But, I'd say, but, I know lots of young people in the same situation, and they would look at me as if to say, you liar, because they didn't believe me, because they don't know anybody else in that situation. I wrote it for families. So there's actually a section on, what happens if your child stops talking at home? How scary is that? But we talk about that, and we talk about burnout. And I wrote it for schools because I need to make support consistent, respectful, and genuinely accessible. Because all this is doable. I wouldn't write it if it was pie in the sky. So basically, the heart of the book is it's not the aim to encourage speech. It's to help them feel safe enough to be able to communicate. And that's a difference. So to the 505 young people who shared their experience, trusted me with their stories, and helped shape this book, thank you very much. And I've had some really positive feedback so far. So I am hoping that other people will find it useful. And what I'm aiming to do, so this is the 2026 version. What I'm aiming to do is update it. So as things change, whether that be the legislation, I mean, who knows what's happening with the HCPs, for instance, or PIP, we'll update it so that there'll be a 2027 version and a 2028 version. Because like with everything else, I'm learning all the time. Things change, what we understand, what we know, and the more we listen to young people, the more we know. So it will be something that moves on. So thank you to them, and thank you very much for listening for that. And I can't believe I actually managed to do a half hour. So I'll just stop sharing and I'm going to stop recording. I'm going to do a little draw now.